I think our spouses are having an affair. The words didn't hit me like a punch. They landed slower than that. Heavier, like something sinking straight through my chest and settling somewhere permanent. I turned my head just enough to look at her, really look this time. Sophia Brooks stood beside me in that dimly lit ballroom, a glass of white wine untouched in her hand, her eyes fixed not on me, but across the room. I followed her gaze without thinking. And there they were. My wife, Emily, standing a little too close to her boss, Ryan Brooks. His hand hovered at the small of her back, not quite touching, but not pulling away either. The kind of distance that says everything without saying a word. The kind of distance you only notice when you already know something's wrong. The room around us was loud, laughter bouncing off crystal chandeliers, the soft clink of glasses, the low hum of money and polished conversations. But in that moment, it all faded into something distant, like I was underwater and everyone else was breathing just fine. How long have you suspected? Sophia asked quietly, her voice steady, almost too steady for what she'd just said. I let out a small breath through my nose, more reflex than response. I didn't, I said. And that was the truth. Not because there weren't signs. There were always signs. I just chose not to read them. Looking back, it's almost embarrassing how neatly everything fits once you stop lying to yourself. The late nights that didn't match her calendar. The way her phone tilted away from me just slightly when she texted. The new tone in her voice when she mentioned work. Not guilty, not nervous, just distant, like she had already stepped into another life and forgot to close the door behind her. I took a sip of my bourbon, letting the burn settle me, something solid in a moment that suddenly felt anything but. You're sure? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Sophia gave the smallest nod, her lips pressing into a thin line. I wasn't at first, she said. But patterns don't lie. Patterns. That word stuck. Because that's what this was. Not a mistake. Not a moment. A pattern. Built over weeks, maybe months, right in front of me. Right in front of both of us. I watched Emily laugh at something Ryan said, her hand briefly resting on his arm like it belonged there. And the worst part wasn't the touch. It was how natural it looked. Like I was the outsider. Like I was the one who didn't belong in that picture anymore. Something inside me shifted then. Not anger. Not yet. Just clarity. Cold, sharp clarity. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that calculates. I set my glass down carefully on the table beside me, making sure it didn't make a sound. If we're right, I said, keeping my voice low, controlled, then what happens next matters more than what already did. Sophia finally looked at me, really looked this time. And in her eyes, I saw it. Not panic. Not heartbreak. Something closer to resolve. I was hoping you'd say that, she replied. I nodded once, slow, deliberate. Because in that moment, standing in a room full of people who had no idea what was unfolding right in front of them, I realized something important. This wasn't the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of something else. And whatever came next wasn't going to be an accident. I did not look at Emily again right away. That was the first decision I made. Not out of fear, not out of denial, but because something in me understood that once you truly see something, you cannot unsee it, and I needed a few more seconds to think like a man who was still in control. The music in the ballroom shifted to something softer, a piano layered over low conversation, and people around us leaned closer, laughing, unaware that two marriages had just cracked open without a single raised voice. Sophia took a small sip of her wine this time, more out of habit than enjoyment, and I noticed the way her fingers tightened slightly around the glass, just enough to reveal what she was holding back. How long? I asked, keeping my tone neutral, like we were discussing something ordinary, like the weather or traffic on the way in. She exhaled slowly before answering. 3 months that I can prove, she said. Maybe longer. 3 months. I repeated it silently, letting the number settle. That was not a mistake. That was a timeline. Long enough for planning. Long enough for lies to become routine. Long enough for two people to believe they would not get caught. I nodded once, more to myself than to her. Emily has been working late a lot recently, I said. New projects, new clients, more travel. The words sounded reasonable. They always had. That was the problem. Sophia gave a faint, almost humorless smile. Ryan started taking calls outside, she said. Said it was company policy. Privacy. Confidential deals. She paused, then added quietly. He never cared about privacy before. Patterns again. Different details, same shape. I picked up my glass again, but this time I did not drink. I just held it, feeling the weight of it, grounding myself in something physical while everything else shifted. Across the room, Emily laughed again, her head tilting back slightly, and Ryan leaned in just enough to close the space between them for a second that lasted too long to be accidental and too short to be obvious to anyone who was not looking for it. I was looking now. That was the difference. We cannot confront them here, Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not like this. I shook my head immediately. No, I agreed. That would give them control. The words came out calm, but inside, something sharper was forming. Not anger. Not yet. Strategy. Because the truth is, confrontation is emotional, and emotion is messy, and messy people lose. I had no intention of losing. Sophia turned slightly toward me, her posture straightening just a fraction, like she had been waiting for permission to stand up without actually moving. Then what do we do? She asked. It was not a desperate question. It was a practical one. And that told me everything I needed to know about her. I glanced around the room again, taking in the details I had ignored before. The executives, the partners, the people who mattered in both of their professional lives. The environment they had chosen to play their game in. And suddenly, I understood something they clearly did not. They thought this was private. It was not. Nothing about this was private anymore. We watch, I said finally, my voice low, steady, controlled. We listen, and we do not make a move until we know exactly how far this goes. Sophia studied my face for a second, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that would suggest I might break under pressure. She did not find it. Instead, she gave a small nod, slower this time, more certain. All right, she said. I allowed myself one more glance across the room, just long enough to lock the image into my mind. Emily, my wife, standing in a life she thought I did not see, and Ryan beside her, comfortable, confident, unaware. They both looked relaxed. Safe. That was the illusion. And illusions only work until someone decides to tear them down. I set my glass down again, this time with intention. Because whatever this was, whatever they thought they were building behind our backs, it had just met something they did not plan for. And for the first time that night, I was not wondering if something was wrong. I knew it was. And more importantly, I knew exactly what I was going to do about it. The next 30 minutes moved differently after that. Not slower, not faster, just sharper, like someone had adjusted the focus on a lens I did not know I was looking through. Every detail stood out now. Every glance, every shift in posture, every second that lasted a fraction too long. I stayed where I was, not hiding, not approaching, just existing in the same space with a different level of awareness. Sophia remained beside me, composed, her expression neutral enough to pass for polite interest in the room, but I could tell she was tracking the same movements I was. Across the ballroom, Emily and Ryan drifted between conversations, but they never stayed apart for long. It was subtle, almost impressive in its execution. They never stood too close when others were watching directly, never said anything that would raise an eyebrow in isolation. But patterns are not built on isolated moments. They are built on repetition. And once you see the repetition, you cannot ignore it. I watched as Emily excused herself from a small group near the bar, her hand brushing Ryan's sleeve as she passed him, just enough to signal something without making it obvious. He waited exactly 5 seconds before following, finishing his sentence, nodding at the people around him like nothing had changed. To anyone else, it looked like coincidence. To me, it looked rehearsed. They are careful, Sophia murmured under her breath, her eyes still forward. Careful is not the same as smart, I replied quietly. Because careful people still make mistakes. They just take longer to reveal them. We moved slightly closer to the edge of the room, not enough to draw attention, but enough to widen our view. The hallway leading toward the private lounge area sat just beyond a row of tall glass doors, partially obscured by a decorative partition. I saw Emily disappear behind it first. Ryan followed shortly after. Again, not together. Never together. That was their rule. I felt something tighten in my chest, not pain, not anger, just a recognition of what I was seeing play out in real time. 3 months. Maybe longer. And this was how they operated. Efficient. Predictable. Confident. Do you want to follow them? Sophia asked, her voice controlled. But there was a slight edge now, the first crack in her composure. I considered it for a moment, the instinct immediate and obvious. Catch them. End it right there. Force the truth into the open. But instinct is rarely the right move. I shook my head slowly. No, I said. Not yet. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at me from the corner of her eye. Why? I let a second pass before answering, choosing the words carefully. Because right now, they think they are in control, I said. The moment we react, that changes. And when it changes too early, we lose the advantage. She held my gaze for a brief moment, then nodded once, understanding settling in. This was no longer about confirmation. We already had that. This was about timing, about leverage, about making sure that when everything came out, it did not just hurt. It mattered. I glanced toward the hallway again, noting the time on my watch out of habit. 9:42 p.m. Small details. They always matter later. Around us, the party continued uninterrupted. Glasses clinked, conversations overlapped. Someone laughed too loudly near the stage, completely unaware of the quiet collapse happening just a few feet away. That was the strange part. The world does not stop when your reality shifts. It keeps moving, indifferent, steady, almost mocking in its normalcy. Sophia straightened her shoulders slightly, her grip on the wine glass loosening just enough to signal control returning. Then we keep watching, she said. It was not a question this time. I gave a small nod. We keep watching, I confirmed. Because now that I understood the pattern, I knew something else for certain. Patterns always repeat. And the next time they did, we would be ready. They came back separately, just like they left. Emily first, smoothing a strand of hair behind her ear as she stepped out from behind the partition, her expression composed, her posture relaxed, as if she had simply taken a phone call or checked on something routine. Ryan followed nearly a minute later, adjusting his cufflinks, his pace unhurried, his face carrying that same polished confidence he had worn all night. To anyone else, it meant nothing. To me, it confirmed everything. I did not move. I did not react. I let the moment pass through me, cataloging it the same way I would any other detail that might matter later. Sophia saw it too. I did not need to look at her to know that. The slight shift in her breathing, the almost imperceptible tightening of her shoulders, told me enough. That is their pattern, she said quietly. Not a question, a conclusion. I nodded once. And patterns can be mapped, I replied. Because now it was not just suspicion or even confirmation. It was structure. Predictable behavior, repeated under the assumption of privacy. That assumption was their weakness. Emily rejoined a group near the center of the room, laughing lightly as if nothing had changed, as if she had not just stepped out of her marriage for a few minutes and returned without consequence. I watched her carefully, not with emotion, but with clarity. The way she held her glass, the way she leaned slightly toward people she wanted to impress, the way her smile adjusted depending on who was looking. It was all familiar. That was what made it different now. Familiar, but no longer trustworthy. You still want to wait? Sophia asked, her voice more controlled again. But this time there was something underneath it, something sharper, more focused. I took a slow breath, letting the air settle before answering. Yes, I said, because we only get one moment where this matters most. And if we use it too early, we waste it. She turned slightly toward me, studying my face again, measuring something. You are not angry, she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation. I almost smiled at that, but not quite. I am, I answered calmly. I am just not using it yet. That seemed to land. She gave a small nod, accepting the distinction. Around us, the event continued to unfold in its usual rhythm. A server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, the soft clink of glass echoing lightly as guests reached for another drink. Someone near the stage began a speech, drawing polite attention from the crowd, creating a natural shift in focus that pulled eyes away from the edges of the room. It was the kind of moment people forget to pay attention, the kind of moment where mistakes happen. I glanced toward Emily again and noticed something new this time. Not her. Her phone. She checked it briefly, her thumb moving quickly across the screen, then slipped it back into her clutch with a small, practiced motion. Seconds later, across the room, Ryan did the same. Not obvious. Not synchronized enough for anyone to question. But close enough. Close enough to confirm communication. They are still talking, I said under my breath. Sophia followed my line of sight, her expression tightening just slightly. Of course they are, she replied. People like that always think they are invisible. Invisible. That word stayed with me for a second. Because that was exactly what they believed. That no one was paying attention. That no one was connecting the dots. That their story was contained. I looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces, the positions, the structure of the space. Then I looked back at Sophia. We are not going to confront them tonight, I said quietly. But we are not leaving empty-handed either. She raised an eyebrow slightly, the first hint of curiosity breaking through her controlled demeanor. What do you mean? I let a small pause stretch between us, just long enough to make the answer matter. It means, I said, my voice steady, deliberate. Tonight is not the end of anything. I glanced once more toward Emily, then back to Sophia. It is the beginning of how we take control of it. And for the first time since this started, I saw something shift in her expression. Not doubt. Not fear. Alignment. Because she understood now. This was no longer about what they had done. It was about what we were going to do next. I did not rush the next step. That was the second decision I made. Because once you understand the pattern, the instinct is to act, to interrupt it, to force a conclusion. But forcing a conclusion too early only benefits the people who created the lie in the first place. I leaned slightly closer to Sophia, lowering my voice just enough to disappear into the background noise of the room. We need proof, I said. She did not respond immediately, but I saw the shift in her eyes. Not surprise. Recognition. Like she had already considered it, but needed to hear it said out loud. Not suspicion. Not patterns. Something they cannot talk their way out of. She nodded slowly, her grip on the glass finally relaxing as if the idea itself gave her something solid to hold on to. I have some things, she said carefully. Messages. Not explicit, but enough to suggest something is off. I tilted my head slightly. That is a start, I replied. But not enough. Because people like Emily and Ryan did not get caught by half-truths. They survived those. They explained them away. They turned them into misunderstandings. What we needed was something clean. Something undeniable. Across the room, Emily's laughter cut through again, lighter than before, almost effortless. I studied her for a moment, not as a husband anymore, but as someone observing a subject. The way she positioned herself near the center of attention, the way she maintained just enough distance from Ryan to appear appropriate while still orbiting within his space. It was controlled. Intentional. That meant it could be predicted. They are not just reacting, I said quietly. They are planning. Sophia glanced at me, her brow tightening slightly. What makes you say that? I let a small pause stretch before answering, choosing precision over speed. 3 months, I reminded her. That is not impulse. That is structure. And structure always leaves a trail. Her expression shifted again, something sharper forming beneath the surface. Then we follow the trail, she said. Not emotional. Not reactive. Focused. I gave a small nod. Exactly. A server passed by again, offering another round of drinks, and I took one without really thinking, more for appearance than anything else. The cold glass in my hand grounded me, kept everything measured. I checked my watch again. 10:08 p.m. Another detail. Another marker in a timeline that was starting to build itself piece by piece. They will slip, I continued. Not here. Not tonight. But somewhere. People always do when they think they are safe. Sophia let out a quiet breath, almost like she had been holding it for longer than she realized. Ryan has a business trip next week, she said. Chicago. 3 days. I did not react immediately, but the information landed exactly where it needed to. I nodded once, slowly. Emily mentioned a conference, I said. Same days. That was it. The first real overlap. Not coincidence. Not anymore. Confirmation layered over pattern. Sophia looked at me fully now, no hesitation left in her posture. So this is where it goes, she said. I met her gaze evenly. No, I corrected calmly. This is where it begins. Because now we had more than suspicion. We had direction. A place, a time, a structure that could be tested, observed, confirmed. The party around us continued, speeches wrapping up, music shifting again, people starting to loosen as the night moved forward. But for me, the night had already changed. The moment Sophia spoke those first words, everything shifted from reaction to strategy. I glanced one more time at Emily, at the woman I had built a life with, now standing in a version of it I no longer recognized. There was no anger in that moment. Just clarity. Cold, precise clarity. And as I turned back to Sophia, I knew we were no longer standing on the same side of the story as they were. We were ahead of it. And the next move was ours. The rest of the night became a performance, and I played my part perfectly. That was the third decision I made. Not to withdraw, not to distance myself, but to stay visible, present, exactly where Emily expected me to be. Because disappearance raises questions, and questions create awareness. And awareness was the one thing we could not afford to give them yet. I moved through the room with the same calm rhythm I had carried in, exchanging nods, shaking hands, responding when spoken to, all while keeping a quiet track of where Emily was, where Ryan was, and more importantly, when they were not where they were supposed to be. Sophia did the same. We did not stay side by side anymore. That would have been too obvious. Instead, we adjusted, creating space, circling the room from different angles, two separate observers watching the same pattern unfold. It was subtle, but effective. Every 10 minutes or so, one of them would drift. Not always at the same time, not always in the same direction, but always with purpose. A call, a quick check, a moment away from the crowd that stretched just a little longer than necessary. And each time, the other would follow, delayed just enough to maintain the illusion. I checked my watch again. 10:37 p.m. Another marker. Another piece of a pattern that was no longer invisible. When Emily finally approached me again, it felt almost scripted. She smiled, soft, familiar, the same expression she had used for years, the one that used to mean something different. "Are you having a good time?" she asked, her voice light, casual, like nothing in the world had shifted. I met her eyes, steady, calm. "Yeah," I said. "It is a good event." The words came easily. That was the part that surprised me. Not the lie, but how natural it felt. She nodded, satisfied with the answer, already half-turned towards something else, someone else. "I might step out for a quick call," she added, almost as an afterthought. Of course she would. I gave a small nod. "Go ahead," I replied. No hesitation. No suspicion. Exactly what she expected. She smiled again, brief, polite, then walked away, disappearing toward the same hallway I had watched earlier. I waited. Not long. Just enough. Then I shifted my position slightly, angling myself so I could see the entrance without making it obvious. And right on cue, Ryan followed. Not immediately, not obviously, but predictably. I exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, not out of anger, but out of confirmation. This was no longer theory. This was routine, a system they believed was flawless. Sophia reappeared at my side a minute later, her timing just as precise. "Same move," she said quietly. I nodded once. "Same pattern," I replied. We did not follow them. We did not need to. We already knew what was happening behind that wall. What mattered now was how often it happened, how consistent it was, how easy it had become for them to repeat it without fear. "Chicago," I said under my breath. "That is where we test it." Sophia did not respond right away, but I saw the shift in her posture again, the way her shoulders squared slightly, the way her expression settled into something more defined. "And if we are right?" she asked. I turned my head just enough to meet her eyes. "Then we stop watching," I said calmly. "And we start acting. Because there is a point where observation ends and execution begins." And as I stood there, watching the hallway where my wife had just disappeared with a man she thought I did not see, I realized we were getting very close to that point. Not tonight. Not yet. But soon. Very soon. We did not speak much after that. There was no need. The plan had already taken shape in the quiet spaces between our words, and anything more would have only made it louder than it needed to be. The party began to wind down around 11:15 p.m., conversations thinning, laughter softening, people checking their watches and gathering coats. The kind of natural ending that allows everyone to leave without questions. Emily returned to me with the same composed expression, her hand lightly brushing my arm, as if to re-establish something that had already slipped away. "Ready to go?" she asked, her tone warm, familiar, practiced. I nodded once. "Yeah," I said. "We should head out." There was no hesitation in her eyes. No guilt. No second thought. That was the part that stayed with me the most. Not what she had done, but how easily she moved past it, like stepping out of one room and into another without closing the door behind her. We said our goodbyes, polite and measured, the same way we had arrived. Ryan stood a few feet away, shaking hands, smiling, his posture relaxed, his confidence intact. Sophia stood beside him, equally composed, her expression giving nothing away. And for a brief moment, all four of us existed in the same frame. Two couples standing side by side, one version visible, the other hidden just beneath the surface. It was almost impressive if you looked at it the right way. Almost. Emily and I stepped out into the cool night air, the city quieter than it had been hours earlier, the distant hum of traffic replacing the noise of the ballroom. The valet pulled our car around, headlights cutting across the pavement as we approached. She slipped into the passenger seat, adjusting her dress slightly, checking her reflection in the mirror as if the night had been nothing more than a routine social event. I started the engine, the low sound of it filling the silence between us. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she turned slightly toward me. "I think that went well," she said. I kept my eyes on the road as we pulled away from the curb. "Yeah," I replied evenly. "It did." Another pause. Not uncomfortable. Just empty. She glanced down at her phone briefly, her thumb moving quickly across the screen before she set it back in her lap. A habit I had seen 100 times before. One I now understood completely. "I might have to finalize a few things for that Chicago conference," she added casually. There it was. Introduced like it meant nothing. Like it had not already been placed on the board hours earlier. I nodded slightly, keeping my tone neutral. "Let me know if you need anything," I said. She smiled faintly, satisfied, turning her attention back to the window as the city lights passed by in quiet streaks. I drove the rest of the way in silence, not because I had nothing to say, but because there was nothing left to discuss. Not yet. Not until the right moment. As we pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. Lights off, quiet still. The kind of place that suggests stability from the outside. I turned off the engine and sat there for a second longer than necessary, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Emily opened the door and stepped out, walking toward the house without looking back, already moving into the next part of her night, her routine, her version of normal. I followed a moment later, locking the car, the sound of it echoing softly in the quiet street. Inside, everything was unchanged. The same furniture, the same framed photos, the same life we had built together. But it felt different now. Not broken. Not yet. Just exposed. I watched her move through the house, setting her things down, slipping back into a role she had played for years without thinking. And for the first time, I saw it clearly for what it was. Not a life. Not a partnership. A structure. One that could be taken apart piece by piece if you knew where to start. I loosened my tie slowly, my movements deliberate, controlled. Chicago. That was where the next step happened. Not a guess. Not a possibility. A certainty. And as I stood there in the quiet of my own home, I realized something that made everything else fall into place. They thought they were ahead of us. They thought they had time. They were wrong. Because now, we were not just watching anymore. We were preparing. And the next move was already in motion. The next morning did not feel different on the surface. That was the part most people misunderstand about moments like this. There is no dramatic shift, no visible crack in the routine. The alarm went off at 6:30 a.m. The coffee brewed at 6:35, and by 7 o'clock I was standing in the kitchen watching sunlight spill across the same countertops that had been there for years. Emily moved through her routine like she always did, precise, efficient, completely at ease. She asked if I wanted eggs. I said yes. She asked if I had any meetings. I told her I did. The conversation was normal. Too normal. That was the illusion she relied on. That normal meant safe. I watched her carefully, not in a way that would draw attention, but in a way that collected information. The way she checked her phone before taking a sip of coffee. The way she angled the screen slightly away from me without thinking. The way her responses came half a second slower when she was distracted. These were not new behaviors. They were just newly understood. "I booked my flight for Chicago," she said casually, setting a plate in front of me. "Thursday morning, early." I nodded, cutting into the eggs without looking up right away. "Same here," I replied. "I have something in that area as well." That was not entirely a lie. Not anymore. She paused just briefly, a flicker of something crossing her expression, then it was gone. "Oh," she said lightly. "That is convenient." Convenient. I almost smiled at that, but I kept my expression neutral. "Yeah," I said. "It is." She did not press further. That told me enough. If there had been nothing to hide, there would have been curiosity, questions. Instead, there was acceptance. Controlled, measured acceptance. After breakfast, we moved through the rest of the morning like nothing had changed. She left first, heels clicking softly against the hardwood as she headed out the door, calling back a quick goodbye that sounded exactly like every other day. I waited until her car disappeared down the street before I moved. Not out of hesitation, but out of timing. I picked up my phone and sent a single message. "We are on." Sophia responded within seconds. I know. There was no need for more words. We both understood what came next. The next 3 days were not about emotion. They were about preparation. I adjusted my schedule, moved meetings, created space where there had not been any before. Not enough to raise suspicion, just enough to give me flexibility. At the same time, I paid closer attention to everything Emily did. Not confrontationally, observationally. The calls she took outside. The emails she closed quickly when I walked into the room. The way her tone shifted when certain names came up. Each detail added to the structure we were building. Each one made the picture clearer. By Wednesday night, everything was set. Flights confirmed. Hotel booked. Timing aligned. I packed my bag with the same care I would for any trip. Nothing unusual, nothing that would stand out. Emily did the same, moving around the bedroom with quiet efficiency, folding clothes, checking lists, maintaining the same calm she had shown since the party. "I will see you Sunday," she said as she zipped her suitcase. I looked up at her, meeting her eyes for just a moment. "Yeah," I replied. "Sunday." She smiled, soft, familiar, the same expression she had used for years. And for the first time, I saw it clearly for what it was. Not reassurance, not connection, just part of the role. That night, I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing as she fell asleep without hesitation. No tension, no weight, nothing to suggest she was carrying anything beyond her own version of the truth. I turned my head slightly, looking at her in the dim light, and felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger, not sadness, resolution. Because the next time we stood in the same room, it would not be like this. It would not be quiet. It would not be controlled by them. Chicago was not a coincidence. It was the moment everything moved from theory to proof. And this time, we were not going to watch it happen. From a distance, we were going to be there when it did. Chicago did not feel like a coincidence when I stepped off the plane. It felt like a checkpoint. The air was colder than back home, sharp enough to wake you up the second you walked outside. And for the first time in days, everything inside me was completely still. Not empty, not numb, focused. I checked into my hotel without delay, a place just far enough from the downtown core to avoid attention, but close enough to everything that mattered. Timing had already been mapped out. Emily's conference hotel was less than 10 minutes away. Ryan's company had booked the same one. That was not a guess. That was confirmed. I sent a short message. "I am in." Sophia replied almost instantly. "Lobby. 20 minutes." When I walked into that hotel lobby, it felt nothing like the party. There were no chandeliers, no laughter, no distractions. Just quiet conversations, the soft roll of suitcases across polished floors, and people moving with purpose. Sophia stood near the far side, dressed simply, blending in without trying. When she saw me, she gave a small nod. No greeting, no wasted motion. We had already passed that stage. "They checked in an hour ago," she said calmly. "Separate reservations. Same floor." I nodded once, letting that settle. Of course they did. Careful, but not careful enough. "Have you seen them?" I asked. "Not together," she replied. "But close enough." That was all we needed. We did not rush. That would have broken everything. Instead, we moved like we had at the party. Controlled. Observing. Tracking. We took seats in the lobby, separate but aligned. Each of us watching different angles, different elevators, different movements. Time passed slowly, but not uselessly. Every minute added clarity. At 6:12 p.m., Emily stepped out of the elevator, dressed for what she had called a networking dinner. She did not see me. I made sure of that. She crossed the lobby with confidence, her posture relaxed, her expression exactly the same as it had been the night of the party. 10 seconds later, Ryan appeared. Not beside her, not acknowledging her, but following the same path, same direction, same exit. I stood slowly, adjusting my jacket like I was heading out for my own evening. Sophia did the same from the opposite side. No words, just movement. Outside, The city lights reflected off glass and steel, the sound of traffic steady, indifferent. We kept our distance, far enough to remain unseen, close enough to not lose them. They walked 2 blocks, turned into a quieter street, then entered a smaller hotel attached to a private restaurant. Not crowded, not public enough to draw attention. Strategic. I stopped just before the entrance, watching as they disappeared inside, seconds apart. Sophia stepped up beside me, her voice barely above a whisper. That is it. I nodded once. That is enough. Because it was. We had the pattern. We had the location. We had the timing. And more importantly, we had certainty. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, not to call, not to confront, but to capture what mattered. The timestamps. The entries. The sequence. Clean. Undeniable. Something they could not explain away. When I looked back at the door, I did not feel anger. I did not feel the need to walk in or interrupt or make a scene. That was not the point. The point was already achieved. I turned to Sophia, meeting her eyes for a brief moment. We are done watching, I said quietly. She held my gaze, then nodded once, firm, resolved. Then we finish it, she replied. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, taking one last look at the place they thought was hidden, the place they believed was safe. It was neither. It never had been. As we turned and walked away, the city noise swallowed the moment. Just another night in a place full of people living their own stories. But ours had already shifted. Not because of what they did inside that building, but because of what we chose not to do. We did not react. We did not break. We waited. And now, we had everything we needed. When I finally spoke again, my voice was calm, steady, exactly the way it had been from the beginning. They chose this. And this time, there was nothing left for them to control.